I regret to inform you that I am wearing a shirt today. That being said, I'm looking pretty good with these Pickems, guys. If you followed my advice, you at least got that basic-ass coin for whatever your weird microtransaction fetish actually is worth. We're looking at this point with quite a few of these picks proceeding through, right? In fact, every single team that I picked to advance to the next stage in the bottom part went through. Despite the fact that some of these picks were very surprising to people. The Copenhagen Flames pick, them going 3-0, also would have been fine to swap them with Virtus.pro. ENCE going through, some people were doubting that. Entropic, nobody had them on their radar. I think less people had Entropic on their radar than like people had Big, for example, or even Copenhagen Flames for that matter. So, like I said earlier, I'm feeling pretty good about those picks, and I think we can sort of write that one in on our credit report here. We can boost our social credit or something. I don't know, moving into China. But it doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It matters if you can do it again. Actually, it does matter what you've done in the past, as Hunden has proven. But we're not talking about Hunden. We're talking about Heroic, who have squeaked by and celebrated, which they shouldn't have done. They're idiots. The celebration will be in order if they can make it through to the next stage. But I wouldn't bet on it. Their first matchup is up against... who's their first matchup up against it? Does anybody have information about the starting matchups? Ah, this convenient graphic from PGL will tell me everything I need to know, as long as I tighten my glasses and get very close to the screen so I can read all of the necessary information. Heroic are going up against Na'Vi. I don't think they're winning that matchup. I don't think that's very controversial. Now, it is best of ones, but since the secondary stream is now going to be played on stage, that has a pretty big impact on whether or not some teams will be advancing. Because, like it or not, there are still some asterisks to Copenhagen Flames making it to this stage, for example, or even Entropic for that matter. You know, the stage time has been very minimal for these teams, or in some cases completely absent, right? So some of the teams that made it through didn't necessarily prove it to the same degree as other teams did. Most notably, the teams that went 3-2, like Astralis and Heroic, had to spend a little bit more time on the battlefield. So all right. What does that all mean exactly? What does that word salad predict Heroic ends up? I think Heroic, they stand an okay chance of making it through to the next stage, but there are plenty of other teams that we can sort through here. And this is where we separate the men from the boys, as it were. I did say it was the era of upsets. It was the year of the upset leading into this stage. But I think it's time to start tightening the belt for some of these lower-ranked teams, these less proven teams, and really make sure that if we're predicting some of them to go through, we have very sound logical arguments that don't involve things like them playing from practice rooms, as those are no longer going to be the case. And of course, the longer the tournament ramps up, the more I start to weigh veteran experience and a lack of stage fright in general. And especially when we get to the champion stage, where teams are actually in an arena with a crowd, that's going to play a massive factor. So in some ways, even if I predict somebody like Copenhagen Flames to make it through to the next stage, they might not do a whole lot of damage once they reach playoffs, right? Because when's the last time they've been in a crazy arena at the height of their power? You know, basically never, right? So you never can rule them out necessarily in such a situation, but you also can't really root for them and back them while still maintaining some sort of intellectual honesty as an analyst. The first things first, who's going 0-3? There are some juicy prospects for the 0-3. In fact, there are 3 of them. There are FURIA, Evil Geniuses, and Mouz. Now, FURIA are a bit under strength insofar as they haven't had a lot of stage time, or really any stage time at all, with drop. So I don't, massively expect them to do too much. I also think that the lack of coach, despite the fact that recently coaches have been fucking neutered by Valve, unfortunately, Gary is not even in here in the conversation to even potentially be affected by this ruling. So I think FURIA are a pretty safe bet for the 0-3 rule. And remember, 2 teams will do that. So, we're almost picking between who are the logical teams to do that, and then of those teams, the teams that might go 0-3, who do we believe will actually go 0-3? So FURIA is the first pick, and they're pretty likely, actually. I would say aside from that, we do indeed have Evil Geniuses as a top pick for 0-3, but I do think that they'll get at least 1 win in this stage just because they've had enough downtime, they are unproven enough with this lineup, insofar as this specific lineup hasn't had time to prepare for a studio stage match in recent history with this exact 5-man lineup. I can't imagine, maybe one of the Blast events, Evil Geniuses was still rocking this lineup and played in a studio event, but I don't even think so for those events. I think realistically speaking, they probably just got banged out from boot camps. This is a very different environment for them, and not all of those players are very young, and not all of those players are very inexperienced, although some of them are, but I still think they're good for a game, so I can't really in good conscience put them in the 0-3 category. I think they're the least likely 0-3 option. And of course, the other 0-3 option being Mouz, as mentioned before. I really don't expect this roster to do too much. Rops and Frozen are money. Maybe Bemis is going to be okay and continue to be somewhat consistent. Acor's obviously just, what is he doing? And Dexter seems like a middle of the road IGL. So none of this team really convinces me. And against some of the competition that they have, again, going back to our graphic from PGL earlier, I don't really expect Mouz to defeat NIP in their opening match. So this is where we can start to use the opening matchups that we have available to us as color for our predictions, because we can have some reasonable certainty of these opening matchups. So FaZe versus EG, Mouz versus NIP, Astralis versus FURIA. I think in all of those cases, our prospective 0-3 teams will lose. I think Astralis will be FURIA. I think FaZe will be EG. I think Mouz will lose to NIP. So, obviously, we haven't seen a lot of these teams. Like NIP, for example, hasn't played in a while. FURIA hasn't played in a while. These teams that are coming in and have just been sitting in their little posh ivory towers for the longest time, looking down at the peasants fighting over who gets to siege the castle in the next war game. We haven't really seen some of these sort of CSGO royalty in action for a while. So there is an element of some of these teams are played into form. Mouz, maybe they can maintain the form that got them over the finish line against Big, and maybe that's good enough for a best of one against NEP. But I still think FURIA are the least likely to actually make it through, given the situation that we've seen with Astralis, where they're constantly heating up, and I do predict Astralis to make it out, spoiler. So I have to, in good conscience, then put FURIA as my 0-3. Sorry, Brazilian fans. It's just the way it has to be. Now, that being said, I do think Mouz is also likely to go 0-3. I don't think Evil Geniuses will win their game against FaZe, but they are good for an upset somewhere down the line, and especially as things get a little bit more messy, you might actually see Evil Geniuses against Mouz or something like that, right? Something like that could happen, theoretically, down the Swiss system. So keep that in mind as well. And, especially if Mouz gets an upset, you could easily see that happening. I just don't think FURIA will be able to upset Astralis, even in a best of one, especially after the scares that they've seen. And they've played themselves into some degree of form. They looked absolutely unapproachable by Team Spirit in their matchup earlier today, as of the day of recording. I don't predict that Astralis will drop this opening matchup, which leaves FURIA in an 0-1's position by the end of the first day. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. I also just don't rate this lineup at all. I feel like they've done nothing since Henny has left the roster. So get him out of here and go next. Next up on the chopping block is the 3-0 slot. There's a number of options that I could go for this. I could go for everybody's tournament favorite in Navi. I could pick NIP as well as a roster that is definitely slated to get out of this stage. But again, I want to go back to my old sort of wisdom. I did predict Virtus.pro to go 3-0, not because I thought that they would go 3-0 necessarily, but because I thought they would either go 3-0 or they would get eliminated. Now, they did end up going 3-1, so I wasn't that far off the money, but that was mostly because I wasn't expecting FaZe to activate that instantaneously in an opening matchup. So I failed to take into account whether or not Kerrigan would be an utter god later on in their, I think it was the round 2 matchup that they played. So that was a case where, obviously VP didn't end up winning it out 3-0. I don't predict them again. I actually don't predict VP to make it out of this stage. I'm certainly willing to be wrong on that front, but as you'll see when we start filling out the roster of teams down below, we're getting to a point where it's very hard to figure out who the last couple slots are actually going to be decided by. I think it's safe to say we're not going to predict Evil Geniuses to make it out. I think it's safe to say as well that we're not going to be predicting Copenhagen Flames to make it out necessarily. It starts to get a little bit harder after the fact, right? So I'm going to put FaZe Clan as my 3-0 pick. I think it's not just recency bias from FaZe going 3-0 in the previous stage. I think Kerrigan really does know what the fuck is up on LAN. I think this team gels on LAN in a different way. And I especially think that their opening matchup being against Evil Geniuses is a massive layup. And the seeding is all out of whack for this particular tournament as a result of the fact that theoretically Evil Geniuses should actually be the favorite in this matchup by seeding. It makes absolutely no sense because obviously FaZe Clan themselves are massive favorites going into this just by the eye test. So I expect them to go up on a very early 1-0 start, and then I expect them to continue that form as they have thus far. Easy coast into the champion stage where they can play playoffs and maybe make it as far as semifinals, perhaps. We'll see. We'll get to that stage later. So with my 0-3 and my 3-0 selected, it's time to start making the hard cuts. Na'Vi are a very obvious lock. I don't think that they'll necessarily go 3-0, but they are another pick that you could go. It's just that, again, you're not getting points if the team that you predicted to go 3-0 goes 3-1 the way Pr0 did, right? You don't get any points for that. So I'm thinking that FaZe will go 3-0, or maybe they'll suffer some catastrophic loss and deterioration down the line. But I think it's more likely that they go 3-0 than that they don't make it out at all. So I am sort of breaking that rule in a way. It's just that they are the most obvious team to go for that approach. The other option would be G2, by the way. If you were not interested in the FaZe pick, you just wanted to pick them to advance normally, you could put G2 here because they could easily crash and burn. It's just that I don't rate them at all, so I'm not even going to put them in here. But Na'Vi, yes, absolutely the most obvious lock pick. I think after that, it would be NIP and Vitality. These are very easy teams to get behind in this particular respect. They've got proven experience on their roster. A little bit of mixture in that respect. There are some weak spots if you're just looking at veteran status. But I think it's easy enough to say these teams should have the firepower and the recent history, plus the general experience overall, the pedigree, if you will, to make it through this stage. I'm going to skip over Team Liquid and go to Gambit for the next pick. It just seems sort of like a VP pick, right? It's kind of too obvious to leave them out. Like you can't leave them out in good conscience because they have had such a good year. But I think if I'm going to rank these in order of confidence, I put Gambit a little bit more towards the bottom end of the spectrum. I actually don't have a lot of confidence that Gambit completely makes it out. It might be squeaky bum time for those guys, just because as much as they've had pretty reasonable experience recently, and generally their body of work during the online era is almost second to none. Like, again, it's second to one, I guess you could say. But at the same time, like, we just haven't seen that much of them, and they haven't been able to play themselves into form recently. So just keep that in mind. I still think they should be a lock for this, but there's enough little doubt there where maybe they could get upset by some of these other teams and maybe they don't make it through. So that might be the pick that I'm least confident in so far, although there is one other that I suppose I'll have to make the tough decision on momentarily. We'll move Astralis in. That'll be the team that I guess you could say, fourth most confident in making it out. I think it's just obvious that Astralis are heating up over time. They should be able to make it to playoffs, but I don't necessarily think that they'll be able to make it very deep in playoffs. I think the reason why they're able to make it out of this stage, for my money, is that you still are thriving in the chaos at this point. You still have a situation where overall, the Swiss system is so chaotic, you don't know what team you're playing against next. You got to be adaptable. I don't think they'll make it 3-0. I think it'll be messy. And I think Astralis as well are going to be in a very tough position where going into the next stage of the tournament, they will have played so many games that it will be easy to data mine them when a dedicated best of 3 playoff match is on the line. And that's where I think they'll fall right in the round of 8 as soon as they get in. But I think they'll still make it there. I think they will make it to top 8. Now, this is where we got to start upsetting some people. I think ENCE are more likely to advance, just statistically speaking, than Gambit. I think they'll both advance, but I think ENCE are more of a lock than Gambit because they've played themselves into form at this stage of the tournament. Now, the only argument against ENCE for me is nothing to do with their team cohesion, their strategies, or anything like that. It's the pressure. And this is a team that I think if they go 3-0 or 3-1, if they get really, heated up very early on, and we've seen what they can do in the RMR earlier, in best of 3s in general. Like, we know that this team is legit. It's just we don't know how legit they are. Are they legit in a top 8 sense? I'm willing to bet a little bit of analyst credibility on this pick, because I think ENCE can certainly contend with the top teams. It's just a matter of whether or not they can get past the opening 2 best of 1s and then jump into a best of 3 and still make it through there. That's where I think it's tough to predict them 3-0. And maybe they could even be a good pick for 3-0 because you might predict them to otherwise crash and burn. But I don't think so. I think this team has shown a little bit of grit. I think they've shown a bit of resilience. So I think they'll make it through, maybe 3-1 or 3-2 even. It might be, again, squeaky bum time for the ENCE camp. But they should make it to playoffs for my money over some of the other teams here. Again, I said earlier, I'm not predicting Pr0. I'm not predicting Mouz Sports. I'm not predicting G2. That leaves us with either Heroic or Liquid, realistically speaking, because as much as I love the Entropic guys, I am going to bet against them in this particular case. I think their run comes to an end in the Legend stage, and props to them. They'll probably go out 2-3 in this stage. I think they actually are serious enough contenders to at least bust open the best of ones or get one best of one and then even a cheeky best of 3 upset, but I think their run ends here. I don't think they're able to upset that far. And at this point, I'm either picking a Heroic that's been mired in controversy and still is not proven on the LAN stage to make it all the way to playoffs, or I'm betting on an understrength Liquid with no coach and Pasha Biceps lifting them up as a substitute position. And I think my money has to probably be with the Polish powerhouse Pasha Biceps himself subbing in at the last moment when one of the team members suddenly contracts not COVID, just a normal cold, but still has to quarantine because of overzealous Swedish rules. I think that's probably what happens. And even if that specific situation doesn't happen, I still think Liquid have enough grit that they can make it through despite the fact that Adren happens. But this is another really cautious pick. Again, I've put them last place in my ranking. This left to right is my confidence in a team to advance. And Liquid are the least confident pick that I have. I'm almost tempted to actually swap them into the 3-0 pick, because if they don't get off to a good start, this team feels like fragile enough from a mental perspective to just crash and burn otherwise. So this is a bit of aggressive, but I am going to pick them over Heroic. I think Heroic's run ends here. I think Virtus.pro's run ends here. And I think the rest of the teams, either congrats to make it to this stage, but bye, or you never really should have been in the Legend stage to begin with. You should have proven your worth by qualifying through the major qualifier, so to speak, the Challenger stage, and you didn't have to. So also bye. So what do you think? Do you think that G2 should be in here over one of these teams? You really want to bet on those guys when they've let you down so many times? What about Virtus.pro? You think Flit is actually the answer? You think Sanji was just dumping ops left, right, and center, and that had no effect when he gets removed from the team unceremoniously by management in a move that maybe the players themselves didn't even want? We don't know, because it was just hinted at in interviews over at hltv.org. I don't know the answer to any of these questions, but I'm pretty sure none of these teams are making it through unless they have that check mark next to them, because that's what I decided is going to be the reality. I am running the simulation. Thank you for enjoying your time in it. And that's it. That's the video. Bye.